Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to do an updated starter guide on RetroArch. This is one of my favorite emulator programs that works across a bunch of different platforms, including things like your computer, your phone, your tablet, and so on. It has a robust feature set allowing you to play basically any classic system that you can think of, and it also has some universal compatibility in terms of settings and configuration. However, there is a steep learning curve in understanding how RetroArch works and how to make that initial configuration, and so that's what we're going to focus on in this video. And the fundamentals that we'll go through in this video will apply to all those different platforms that we mentioned earlier. Either way, grab your favorite snack and drink and let's go ahead and get started. Okay, as we get started here, first question, I think probably the most important, is how do you pronounce the name of this application? Now, I personally say RetroArch, but a lot of people say RetroArch with a CH. And honestly, I've asked the RetroArch developers before, and they basically said you can use either one. However, it is based on Arch Linux. And so RetroArch is probably the more correct pronunciation. For me personally, I say RetroArch, and it has to do with just the way that the word looks to me in English. So I think of it like words like monarch and patriarch that have the ARCH ending. They often will have a K sound to them at the end. And so I'm probably more incorrect by saying RetroArch than saying RetroArch, but it's one of those things that I've just kind of stuck with it over the years. Now, another thing you may be wondering is why would you want to use RetroArch specifically compared to other standalone emulators that you could use? Number one for me is the wide system support, that I can play just about every single old retro system on one single application. Another thing I really like is universal button mapping, so I know exactly which button will do what in terms of like turning off the game or going into fast forward. We've also got a ton of video scaling options, a lot more robust than most applications. There's also a ton of different shaders and filters and overlays that you can use as well. We're going to touch on each of these aspects throughout this video, but I also have dedicated guides to each of these as well. I will leave them linked in the video description below. We also have the ability to use playlists, which allows us to browse through and play our games directly within RetroArch, or we can also integrate it with some of our favorite front ends. We'll cover both of these in this video. We've also got a variety of ways of playing our games between in-game saves as well as save states. And there are a bunch of other really handy features like cheats and fast forward and rewind and setting up retro achievements and even using netplay to play with others. Now that that's out of the way, let's actually install RetroArch. I'm going to do this on a Windows computer, but the process will be the same no matter what platform you use. To start, we're going to go into the Downloads tab, which you can find on their main webpage, retroarch.com. From there, you can scroll down and find a list of all the different platforms they support. So you'd want to find your platform, Android, Raspberry Pi, and so on. I'm using a Windows 11 computer, so I'm going to scroll down right here, and then I'm going to find this one right here, the 64-bit installer. Once the app is downloaded, we'll go ahead and open it up and run through the installation process. Anyway, once you've gone through the installation process, we're not actually going to start up RetroArch just yet. I'm going to install another front end as well because it helps me to organize my games. And for this, we're going to use Emulation Station Desktop Edition. Now, this is not necessary to use RetroArch, but I do find that it enhances the overall experience and it is free to use. And so what we're going to do is download and install the Windows installer of this one as well. It is available on other platforms too. Now, the reason why I like to use Emulation Station Desktop Edition is because it will pre-populate a bunch of folders where I can put all of my games inside of. So as an example, as soon as I start up this app, it says that it wants to create all of our game ROM directories. So I'm going to use this as a way of organizing my collection. So under here, I'm just going to select Create Directories, which is going to go into my user file, and that's it. Now I'm going to quit out of the application, and then I'm going to go into my user documents. And so here under my Windows user folder, you can see that we have this ROMs folder that was created by Emulation Station. If I go inside here, you can see a bunch of different platforms. So this is where I'm going to move my ROMs. While I'm in here, I'm also going to make another folder, and I'm going to call this one BIOS. So this is going to be all of my system folders. I'll put them all within here. Now, this is one of those things that really hangs people up because they want to know, where can I find ROM files and what are BIOS files? Where can I find those? And both of these are copyrighted, so you're going to be on your own to find them. These are game files that you can then run with an emulator. We're not going to show you how to do that in this video. There are many ways that you can do this. They have cartridge dumpers that allow you to dump the original game. You can also even pull them from a disk. I've got a couple couple guides about that. I will again leave this all linked down below. But what we're going to do in this video is I'm just going to assume that you have some ROMs that you want to play, and so we're going to focus on the RetroArch side of things. So here on the right side is my ROMs folder that I created with Emulation Station. On the left side is an external flash drive that I just plugged into my computer that has all of my games. So for example, under my GB folder, these are my Game Boy games. What I can do is I can just select all of these and then move them over into the same Game Boy folder on Emulation Station. So this really is just a way to organize your files and ROMs however you would like. Now, in terms of which systems you want to focus on, that's all going to be up to you. But for me in particular, I'm just going to focus on stuff basically up through like Dreamcast and Nintendo 64. I've often found that higher end systems, things like PlayStation 2 and beyond, those are usually best served by using a standalone emulator. So it's a little bit outside of the scope of what I would recommend when it comes to running with RetroArch. Now, if you have any questions about which files you're supposed to put for each system or what BIOS files are most important, then I would recommend the actual RetroArch libretro docs page. This is their own tutorial for each of these systems. So what I recommend doing is going into the For Users tab, and then from there, go down to the Core Library Emulation tab here on the left. From there, you can drill down into any of these platforms and find all the information you're looking for. For example, under Nintendo, let's scroll down here, and then let's find one of these emulator cores. Let's go with the Nestopia one. This is one that's one of my favorite for NES. And within here, we can read all about it, including what file extensions they're looking for, which includes the NES file extension, which is probably the most common. But also bear in mind, you can use 7-zip or zipped files as well. That will usually work in RetroArch too. In addition, if there are any BIOS files required for a system, it will be listed in this core option. So for example, here under BIOS, you can see that if we want to use Famicom Disk System games, which are a part of the whole NES system, you'll need this BIOS file in particular. In addition, I've made a list of the most common BIOS files right here on screen. So if you have any questions about any of these are the files that you're looking for. Now, I'm not going to give you any links to them directly because, like I mentioned, they are copyrighted, but this should help you get on your way. It is worth noting that most systems, especially cartridge-based ones, do not have any BIOS requirements. Okay, the next thing to bear in mind about RetroArch is that it is a controller-focused experience. So you're going to want to have a controller, something like this, plugged into your computer already. Basically, any Bluetooth controller will work, especially something a little bit more modern, like a PlayStation or an Xbox controller. All those will be just fine. I've got a link to some of my favorites in my RetroArch starter guide. So if you have any questions about any of this stuff and where to go for any links, this is what I would recommend. It doesn't really matter where you put your BIOS files, but I found just to keep things organized, I like to make a BIOS folder within the Emulation Station folder like we did earlier. And so this is where I've put all my BIOS files. And this is what I would recommend doing just to keep everything in one self-contained package. Okay, now that we have a controller hooked up and we've got everything installed, let's actually go into RetroArch and get things configured. Again, we're going to be doing this in Windows, so things might be a little bit different depending on the platform that you're using. Either way, first thing I want to do here is make sure that we go full screen. So I'm going to go into the video section, and then under full screen mode, I'm going to turn this one on. Now we can actually see what we're doing, which I think is pretty good. Now there are many different ways that you can make RetroArch look depending on your preferences. They call these menu drivers, and this one is the universal one. It's pretty easy to use, but there is one that I prefer over the others. So I'm going to go down into settings and then down into drivers, and then under menu driver, I'm going to change it from Ozone, which is the default one, to XNB. This one is modeled after the PlayStation 3 menu, and I think it works really well both horizontally as well as vertically. So now I'm going to press the B button a couple times to get back to this main menu, and then under here I'm going to go into the configuration file and save current configuration. This is also a great time to talk about the many ways that you can save files and configurations within RetroArch. The one that we just saved is called a configuration file. It's called retroarch.cfg. This one is the global settings change. So anytime that you want to change everything for all of RetroArch, you're going to save it as a RetroArch configuration file. And also bear in mind, you cannot save a configuration file while a game is running. You have to just do this on its own within the menu. Now, beyond the configuration file, there are what they call overrides, and these are going to be specific to the core and the content directory and the game itself. We'll talk about each of these here in a minute. But for now, just bear in mind that when I'm saying that you're going to change a configuration file, it's going to change all the settings for all of RetroArch. And now that we've changed our menu driver, let's go and quit out of RetroArch. And then we're going to go and start up RetroArch again. And now you can see that we have a different menu driver. It looks like a PlayStation 3. Now we can scroll through horizontally to get to our different menus, and then also vertically within each of these submenus. Now that we have this set up, let's save some of the fundamentals that are required for RetroArch to run properly. First thing we want to do is go into the online updater within the main menu. And the first thing I always like to do is go down to all these things that say update. So I go through these one by one and update the core info files and the assets and the controller profiles and so on and so forth. And once we've gone through and saved each of these, we're now ready to actually start to install the cores that we're going to use to play our games. Now, a core in RetroArch essentially just means an emulator. So as we scroll through the core list, you can see that they're all listing different platforms that you can play. For this video, I'm going to focus mostly on the more popular systems, things like Nintendo and Sega and whatnot, but you can see that there are a bunch of supported systems as I scroll through this list. And for each of these cores, there's going to be a wiki page on that libretro docs page that we were looking at earlier. So if you have any questions about which core plays which games, that's where you can find that information. And also in my RetroArch starter guide, I've got a list of all my favorite cores for each specific platform. And again, we're going to focus mostly on the more popular ones, but if you have any questions about what I recommend, this is what I would check out. Either way, let's go through and download some of these. So I'm going to start with the Gambate core for Game Boy and Game Boy Color, and then for Game Boy Advance, I like the MGBA core. For NES, I like the Nestopia core, and then also for Nintendo 64, I prefer the Mupin 64 Plus one. When it comes to Super Nintendo, I'm going to use the SNES 9X version, and then down within Sega, I prefer the Flycast core for Dreamcast, as well as the Genesis Plus GX core for everything that's related to the Sega Genesis era. And then for Sega Saturn, I prefer the Beetle Saturn core, as long as you have a powerful enough processor. Another favorite console of mine from the classic era is going to be PlayStation 1. I'm always torn between the three options, but I've recently been using the Beetle PSX core the most. Okay, so now that we've downloaded all of the cores that we need, let's actually start configuring our settings. We're going to go up to the main menu, then go over one into the settings menu. And I'm just going to go through these one by one to show you some of my favorite configuration changes that might be applicable to you. For example, under user interface, one of my favorites is to go into the on-screen notifications and then notification visibility and then turn on my display frame rate. This means on the top right corner, I will see the number of frames per second that are running while I'm playing a game. Another thing you can do in the user interface section is go into the appearance section, and here you can make all sorts of changes. For example, under color theme, we can change the overall color of this theme. And some of these get really nice. They have like a nice gradient to them. We have a colorful one like this as well. I'm going to stick with just the regular blue one, but you have a lot of options to choose from. You can change other aspects like the size of the text under the scale factor and so on. Now let's go into the video settings, and by default most of this is configured pretty well, but there might be some things you'd like to change. For example, under output, you have the ability to change which video driver to use. Now we're under Windows, which means we have a lot of options, but it really will depend on the platform you're using. I think the default DirectX 11 under Windows works pretty well, but if you have the ability, for example, under Android to use a Vulkan backend, I would recommend this one. In the next section, we have the scaling options, and there are some pretty important options here. The first is going to be integer scaling. This will allow you to blow up the image from a retro system in a factor of 1 or 2 or 3 and so on. And this is really important if you want to have perfectly balanced pixels. For me personally, if I'm using a high enough resolution display like 1080p and above, I usually will not turn this on. Another important factor is aspect ratio. By default, it's going to be core provided, saying that the emulator itself will determine how wide the image is going to be. And in general, this is what I use as well, because I just trust that the emulator developers know exactly what they want to show. But there are a number of different aspect ratios you could use depending on the output of your screen or what your preferences are. In the next section, we have synchronization. There's not a lot to go on here, but if you are using a high resolution screen, like 120 frames or higher, then I would recommend looking into shader subframes as well as black frame insertion. Both of these are really cool because they can reduce motion blur, but they're a more advanced topic, but there are lots of articles out there about them. And that's really it for video, and audio is actually pretty good by default as well, so let's go directly into input, because there are a lot of things that we can change within here. The first thing you want to do is go into the RetroPad binds, because there may be some things you want to change within your port 1 controls. This is going to be your player 1 controller. Now by default, depending on the controller that you're using, it may already pick up on all of your controls, and so you may not have to adjust anything. So this really is going to apply if something that you're trying to use on the controller is not working properly. For example, your ABXY pattern is off. This is where you can set them manually. The next section I would recommend checking out within the input menu is going to be our hotkey settings. And essentially hotkeys are quick menu options that you can enable by doing a combination of buttons on your controller without having to go back into the menu. And here's a list of my recommended hotkeys, and you can see that one hotkey in particular is a different color. That's the hotkey enable button. So the way this works is your hotkey enable button is the first button you will press, and then you'll use it in combination with any of these other buttons to actually make the hotkey work. In this example, I'm using the select button, but you can really use whatever you would like. So back in the hotkey menu here, I'm going to click on hotkey enable, and then I'm going to press the select button. And that's all it takes to apply that hotkey. So let's go down to the next one, which is going to be our menu toggle. So this is the button we'll press in addition to select that will bring up the RetroArch quick menu. And in this example, I like to use the top button, which is going to be the X or Y button, depending on the type of controller that you're using. You can also see in my diagram that I recommend using a select and start combination to actually quit out of your game. Now in RetroArch, there is two different ways that you can quit out of your game. You can either just quit the application altogether, which is this quit menu right here, or you can choose what they call close content. And it's really going to come down to what you prefer to use as your front end. If you're going to use Emulation Station, I would recommend quitting out of RetroArch every time, but if you're going to stay within RetroArch when you close out of your game, then you can choose close content instead. In today's example, I'm going to choose close content, but because I usually will use Emulation Station, I usually use quit instead. Either way, you can now see that I've assigned my start button to close content. The other hotkeys I recommend setting up is for fast forward toggle. I like to use this one as R2. And then if you want to try out rewind, you can also set this one to L2. Just bear in mind that you have to go into the settings and turn this one on. Another thing I like to do is set up save states and load states with the hotkeys. So I like to do R1 for my save state and then L1 for my load state. In addition, one feature a lot of people like to use is called run ahead. This will allow you to basically reduce input lag. So I like to set this one to the up button on my D-pad. This allows me to turn it on and off while I'm playing a game, which can be handy because some games feel a little bit weird with this turned on. And then finally, under show frames per second, I like to set this one to the X button or the leftmost button on your controller. Either way, once we're done with all these hotkeys, we can back into the main input menu. And the other thing I like to do is go down onto the confirm quit, and I like to turn this one off. When you have it on, it essentially means you have to press select and start twice to quit out of the game, but I prefer to actually just do it one time. So I'm going to set this one to off. Okay, back in the main menu, let's keep going down the list here in the settings. Let's go into frame throttle. This is where you can turn on rewind. So if you want to try out rewind while playing a game, you can set this on right here. Just bear in mind, this requires a bit more of a powerful computer to actually run. So it's really going to be up to you whether or not you want to have rewind as a function. Next, let's scroll down into the saving section within the settings menu. And so what I like to do here is turn on auto save and auto load. This means that every time we end a game, it's going to save a save state. And every time that we start up that same game, it's going to load exactly where we were. So this is really handy if you just want to get in and out of your games without having to worry about saving it before you leave. Further down in the list is what they call achievements. So these are retro achievements, which you can turn on and then also log into. If you don't have an account already, you have to go to retroachievements.org and make a username and password, and this is where you will enter them in RetroArch. And these work kind of like, PlayStation trophies or Xbox achievements in that it'll track your game progress and it'll unlock random achievements as you're playing. It's kind of a nice way to breathe new life into old retro games, but 100% optional. One thing to bear in mind is that by default, they have hardcore mode turned on, which means you cannot use things like save states while having hardcore mode on. Personally, I like to turn this one off because I just generally like to use cheats and save states and stuff like that. And then finally, the last settings menu that I recommend changing is going to be the directory menu. So here we need to point to certain directories that are going to be important. The most important is going to be our system/BIOS folder. If you remember, we created a BIOS folder within Emulation Station. So what I want to do here is I want to point RetroArch to that BIOS folder. So I'm going to go into here, I'm going to back out in the parent directory till I get to the main menu. Now I can go into the C directory and go down into users, and then I can find my Onion profile, and then ROMs is going to be here at the bottom. And then under there, we can find all those Emulation Station folders we created before. I'm going to scroll down to that BIOS folder that I made. After that, I'm going to select use this directory, and from now on, it knows exactly which folder to look into for all of those BIOS files. Next, under File Browser, we want to point to where all of our ROMs are. This is going to make things a lot easier when we create playlists. So here, I'm going to go in and find the C drive again, go down to Users, and then Onion, and then I'll find that ROMs folder, and this is the main folder where all of our game files are. So I'm going to select use this directory. This directory is also important because it shows you where all of your files are being saved. For example, your save files and save states, you can find them here under C drive, then RetroArch, and then saves or states. This means that if you ever want to transfer your save or save states over to a different platform, for example, to Android or something like that, then you can just find these files, copy them, then save them into the save directory within that other platform. And so there we are with our initial setup of RetroArch. I know that was a lot of settings to go through, but we only have to do that one first time. Now that we have everything properly configured, let's go back to the main menu, then down to Configuration File, and save current configuration. Now at this point, we're actually ready to start playing games, but we first need to actually access those games. So the way that we do that is by creating playlists. And you can find the playlist in its own section, which you can see right here where it says import content. We've got two main ways that we can do this. We can either just scan a directory and hope that the content is going to match what RetroArch is looking for, or we can do a manual scan to basically say, hey, this is the system, these are the files, this is where you can find them. Let's do one of each just so you can understand how this works. So under scan directory, I'm going to go down here into my BIOS list and I'm going to pick out Game Boy. And so all I'm going to do is find my Game Boy folder and then select scan this directory. And the reason why this one works in particular is because it uses a file extension which is well known. It's a .gb file. And the only files that are .gb files are Game Boy ROM files, which means that RetroArch knows exactly that that is going to be a Game Boy system. So if we go back into the main menu right here and then scroll to the right, you can see that we now have a Game Boy section within our playlist. And so now we can actually browse through and see all those games that I added previously into my Game Boy folder. One thing of note, you can also add thumbnails to each of these as well, so you can browse through them and actually see the cover of the game. To do that, you want to go back to the main menu and then go into Online Updater and then turn on the On-Demand Thumbnail Downloads. This means that as you scroll through your playlist, it's going to say, hey, I know that game, and it's going to download the thumbnail for you. This only happens that one time that you do it, and it will cause a little bit of slowdown as it's happening. Or if you'd like to just manually download them all at once, you can go into this section within the Online Updater called Playlist Thumbnail Updater. Within here, it'll list out all the playlists you have. We only have the Game Boy one right now. We can select it and it'll go through and download each of these one at a time. Okay, so now if we go back and we actually look at the Game Boy playlist, you can see that we have all these nice thumbnails. Now, it is going to require you to make sure that your names are correct with your ROM folder to make sure that it can actually find the thumbnail for it. But as you can see here, yeah, we can actually browse through our games. So now let's start up a game and actually talk about some of the things that we can change within RetroArch while a game is running. So first thing, let's start up this Game Boy game, and it's going to ask us which core do we want to start it with. And that's because the Game Boy Advance core can actually play Game Boy games. So we're going to pick the Gambate core. This is the core that's made for Game Boy and Game Boy Color, and it's my favorite. Now once we select that, we can run the game, and you'll see that the game will start up, and because I have the BIOS file already loaded, it shows the Nintendo boot logo as well. However, there are some other things that you might notice. The first thing being that this game is running in black and white, which just doesn't look very good when playing a Game Boy game. So to make some changes here, we're going to go into the RetroArch quick menu, which we already set up with our hotkey combinations. So in this example, it's going to be select and the top button on your face buttons, which can be either X or Y depending on what you're using. So when I press that, it's going to bring up this page. So the game is still running, the core is still loaded, but now we have a different set of options. This is called the quick menu. And so the first thing I want to do here is I want to go into the core options. This is going to be specific for whatever core that you have loaded up. In this example, the Gambate core. And within here, there are a bunch of Game Boy focused options that we can change. First thing down here is the Game Boy colorization. You can see that it's automatically turned off, which is why it's showing in black and white. We've got a bunch of different options here, and I recommend using the internal one because that allows us to use different submenus right below it. So now under internal palette, we've got a bunch of different options here. And so we can go through here and pick whatever we would like. Let's keep it on the DMG one for now. And now let's go and hit the back button a couple times to get back into the quick menu and then select resume. And so now as we start up the game again, you can see that it has this Game Boy DMG colorization. Now, one unique thing about the core options menu is that the way you save it is actually to do nothing at all. As long as you make any changes within the core options, it'll save for the entire core. So the next time we open up any other game, it's now going to have that DMG colorization. Let's do an example here. So I'm going to go up here, I'm going to hit close content. So it's going to go back to my RetroArch menu. Let's pick another game. Let's do Contra Alien Wars instead. We're going to run it again, pick our core, and now when it starts up, you can see that we have that Game Boy DMG look. So this is why if we look at all of our different configuration save options, the core options is down in the bottom left in that little box. And that's because these ones are a little bit independent of the whole configuration file thing. Core options just on their own will save. Now that being said, if you wanted to save a core option specific to a game, you can do that as well. You can go into manage core options and then you could save game options. That means that only this game will show the DMG color, all the others will be in black and white. Now in that left bottom box, there are two other things that we can actually change and save them independently. First is going to be remap files. Let's walk through that really quickly. We're going to find this again within the quick menu, but this time under controls. So what we can do here is we can actually change the controls by any specific game. So if we go into port 1 controls, it's going to be the same options that we saw earlier, but this time specific to the game. A good one to focus on is going to be this one here, analog to digital type. Essentially what this means is if we set this to left analog, that means that the D-pad options will still work with the left analog as well. If you remember, an old Game Boy did not have an analog stick to it, but this is essentially saying you can use your analog stick for D-pad type functions. Now it may be that you only want to use this in one specific game, so what you can do here is you can back out to this main control section, and then under Manage Remap Files, you can save the game remap file. This means that anytime you start up this game, you can use that left analog stick and you'll be good to go. And if you want to set that up for every Game Boy game, you can save it as a content directory remap file. That essentially means that everything within the Game Boy folder, where we put all of our ROMs, is going to save that remap file function. To go even a little bit wider, we can save it as a core remap file. That means that everything that uses the Gambate core, which we're using here to launch a Game Boy game. But if you remember what I said earlier, Game Boy Color games also use Gambate core. So if we save this as a core remap file, not only will all the Game Boy games allow us to use that analog stick, but every Game Boy Color game will as well. And so that's the nuance between a game, a content directory, and a core. Now, if we go back to my main slide showing all these different configuration files, you can see that underneath it, there are core overrides, content directory overrides, and game overrides. So let's talk about each of these because they're pretty similar to these remap files we just talked about. And overrides have to do with any configuration you want to make that's not specific to RetroArch as a whole. If you want to do it just for a game or a content directory or a core. A good example here would be if we go back into the main menu and we go into settings, and now let's go into video. And so, for example, under scaling, we have it set to be aspect ratio core provided. But let's say for some reason you wanted it to be full screen instead. So you wanted this to blow up the entire screen, specifically for Game Boy games. After we select that, you can see the Konami logo behind the quick menu is now full across the entire screen. If we go back into the quick menu and resume our game, you can see that yes, now our Game Boy game, for better or for worse, is actually blown up across the entire 16:9 display. And let's say that you like this look and you want to save it. So what you would want to do then is go back into the quick menu and you want to go down into the override section. And now within here, we've got the ability to make a save game override, save content directory override, or save core override. And these are going to work exactly like those remap files we just talked about. If we want to have it blown up for just this one Contra game, we would save it as a game override. If we want every single game in the Game Boy folder to be blown up like this, we would save it as a content directory override. And then finally, if we want it to work for both Game Boy and Game Boy Color, we would make it a save core override. Now, I personally do not want to actually see my games blown up like this, so I'm not going to save anything. So instead, I'm going to go back into those scaling options. I'm going to change this aspect ratio back to core provided. And so there we go, no harm, no foul. All these games are playing in the core provided aspect ratio and we didn't save anything. But essentially that's how the override function works. If we want to save anything within the main menu, but only work for a certain game or a folder or an entire core, this is where we would save them. And then finally, the other thing that we can save that's independent of all the others, so this one's in that bottom left box again, are going to be what they call shader presets. Now shaders can get pretty complex, but essentially it's going to be an overlay or something that you do to affect the image, to either make it look like an old school gaming machine or maybe look like an old CRT television. That's what you use shaders for. And the way you save shaders is independently, much like with those controller remap files as well as those core options that we did earlier. So let's add a shader and then save it and see how this works. So we're going to go in here, turn on shaders, then we're going to select load preset. Once you get into here, you'll have the option of GLSL shaders or slang shaders. This will depend on the video output that you're using. If you remember earlier, we used DirectX 11 and I also recommended Vulkan. And that's because that will use slang shaders, which I think are better than GLSL shaders. So now we can go into this folder here and we'll see a bunch of different options. My favorites are going to be within the handheld section because we are using Game Boy. One of the most common options is going to be one called LCD3X. So I'm going to navigate down to that one and then select it. This will provide a grid effect over the screen itself. So let's back out here, go into quick menu and resume. And now you can see that we have a grid overlay over our image. So this makes it look a little bit more like an original Game Boy screen. So if you're happy with that, let's go down back into shaders and now we're going to save it. Under the save preset section, we have the ability to either save it as a core preset, a content directory preset, or a game preset. Again, it all follows the same patterns of everything we've seen before. I'm going to save it as a core preset. That means that this LCD grid effect is going to work with every Game Boy and every Game Boy Color game. Now that I've selected that, let's go ahead and exit out of this game. We're going to go into quick menu and then close content. And now let's actually load up a Game Boy Color game. To do that, we need to add a playlist. So I'm going to scan directory first. I'm going to go down to the GBC folder, which is where my Game Boy Color games are, and then I'm going to select it. From there, I will select scan this directory. It's going to take a minute, and then the scanning is finished. I can now go back, and now all of a sudden we have a Game Boy Color menu as well. And because we set it to actually download the thumbnails in real time, you can see that they start to appear as you browse through the menu. So let's try to start up a game. Let's do Blaster Master Enemy Below. I'm going to start it up here. It's going to ask me which core I want, and then I can run it. And so there we go. We're getting the Game Boy Color boot logo because I have the BIOS loaded up, and we also have that LCD grid effect happening on the screen. And then also, once I'm done playing the game, I can just close the content by pressing Select and Start like I set up with my hotkey. So that'll take me right back into the main menu. So there we go. We've got two different systems already properly configured, both the original Game Boy and Game Boy Color. Now let's go and add another directory, but this time let's do a manual scan. This is going to be helpful when you're trying to play a system that does not have a universal file extension. For example, a PlayStation game. Those have many different file extensions, but nothing is unique to the actual PlayStation 1. So let's go ahead and set that up. It's actually pretty easy. We're going to go into Content Directory here. Then we're going to scroll down until we find the PSX section. That's going to be our PlayStation 1 section. Once we're here, we can select Scan this directory. And now it's going to ask us, okay, what system are you actually trying to play here now that you've picked your folder? And so within here, I'm going to scroll all the way down until we find the Sony PlayStation 1, which is going to be this one right here. So now we've essentially said, look in this folder, and this is the system you're going to be looking for. After that, it's going to ask us, what is the core that you want to load with this? So we already know it's supposed to be PlayStation, but what PlayStation core are you going to use? We only downloaded one, which is the PlayStation Beetle PSX one, so that's the one we're going to choose. From there, we can go down to the bottom and select Start Scan, so it knows exactly what to look for. Now, if we go back over, you can see that yes, it's showing PlayStation, and it has the games that I loaded up. And again, if we give it a moment, it will actually download the thumbnail as well. So let's start up a game and see what happens. And first thing you'll notice is it's not going to ask us a choice of a core. It's just going to go directly into it, and that's because there's only one PlayStation 1 core set up right now. It also is showing the original PS1 boot logo, which means that I have the proper BIOS loaded as well. And now that we're in the game, there are a couple other things that we can do. Let's press Select and X to get into our quick menu. And now under Core Options, we've got other things that we can adjust because this is going to be specific to the PlayStation core. For example, under Video, I can change the internal GPU resolution. So if I wanted to have it like at a 4x resolution, I could set that instead. We're going to keep it at a native resolution, and that's because we're going to use a CRT shader here in a moment, which I think looks better at a native resolution anyway. So now let's go down into the shaders section here, and let's actually choose a new preset. Again, we'll go into Load Preset and Slang, and then now we're going to go into the CRT folder. And we've got a bunch of different shaders to choose from here. I'm just going to pick a random one here. I really like the Geom Deluxe ones. Let's try that one out. So I've applied that shader, and if I go back into the game now, you can see that it looks a lot more like you're playing on an old television. I think it looks great. And again, if I want to make sure that every single PlayStation 1 game has the same shader effect, I'm going to go into Save Preset, and this time I'm going to save it as a core preset. This means anytime I play a PlayStation 1 game with the Beetle PSX core, it's going to run this CRT shader. So now let's quit out of the game and let's start up another one. So I'm going to go back into this menu, and this time let's do Ape Escape. Now when we start up the game, there are two things you can notice. The first one is that we have that CRT look. You can see that everything's a little bit fuzzy, and that is on purpose. And it's also saying we need a DualShock controller. So let's go into the menu here and actually change that. So we're going to go into Controls and then Port 1 Controls. And now if you look under Device Type, it says PlayStation 1 controller. Let's change it to DualShock, and I bet that menu is going to go away. So let's go back into the game and now resume. And so here I am playing the game with my dual analog stick controls, and it's working great. It also has that CRT effect. Now we're probably not going to want to use the DualShock analog controller on every single PS1 game. So let's save this one as a core remap. Again, we're going to go back into the quick menu, and we're going to go down to Controls, then Manage Remap Files. Now we're going to save it as a game remap file. That means that only this game is going to use the DualShock controller. Everything else is just going to use that standard PlayStation 1 controller. And so there you go, we've now set this game up as well. So at this point, we've set up 3 different systems, and we've got them kind of configured the way we want. We've got colorization going with Game Boy, we've got an LCD grid effect with these 2 systems, and we've also added a CRT TV shader for the PlayStation 1 games, and we've even configured this Ape Escape game to have the DualShock controls. Let's add a couple more games just so we get the hang of it. So I'm going to go into Scan Directory again, but this time let's go down to, say, NES. So this is one that also has a specific file system, and so I don't have to worry about anything here. I can just scan scan the entire directory because all these files have a .nes extension, which means that RetroArch is going to know what to do with them. And so if we back out in the main menu, we can see that we now have the NES system here. And so we can load all of these games up as well. And so now, using the magic of television, I've gone through and added a bunch of other systems: NES, Super Nintendo, Dreamcast, Genesis, as well as Sega Saturn. So we've got a pretty good mix right here, and I can jump into any of these. And any of the configurations that we've already done before can be done again. For example, we want to have a controller remap file, we want to use a shader preset, give it a CRT effect, or we can go into the core options and see what other things that we can change. And so at this point, we're pretty well set up when it comes to RetroArch in terms of at least getting in and out of our games. So now let's talk about some of the things that you can do while in a game to kind of improve your overall experience. So here I'm playing Contra 3: The Alien Wars on Super Nintendo. So let's talk about some of the things we can do in regards to hotkeys. To start, we have the fast forward function, which we set up as a hotkey with select and R2. If you look at the top right, you can see our current frames per second, which is around 60 frames per second. But when I press the hotkey, it goes up to over 2,000 frames per second. So this is a very easy way to get through some of those really boring cutscenes if you just want to get into the action. Another thing we can do is do save states and load states. So for example, I'm back in the game here. I can press select and R1 to do a save state. You can see it on the bottom left. Now if I move the controller over a little bit, then I press select and L1, you can see I'll go back and load the state that I had saved previously. So this is an easy way to just save where you are right then and there, and then just quickly go back to it if you would like. Another thing we talked about was the run ahead. So we can turn that by doing select and up. You can see that run ahead is now enabled. And so this might give you a better feeling in terms of input delay. Again, you can turn that off by pressing select and up again. Another thing that we can do within a game is actually turn on cheats. So let's try this out. We're going to press select and Y or X to bring up the quick menu. And within here, you should find a section that's specifically called cheats. And once we select that, let's go into load cheat file, replace, and then it's going to ask which system are you trying to load a cheat for. We're doing Nintendo, Super Nintendo. It's going to give us a really long list of all these games. Let's scroll all the way down to Contra until we find the game. Now, if we look, there's actually 4 different options right here. There's just a standard Contra 3 Alien Wars cheat. There's also a Game Genie one, as well as Action Replay. There's also one called Rumbles. I'm not sure what that is. Let's go into the Game Genie cheats. Once you select that, it's going to bring you back to that main cheats folder, but now down below, you can see that we have a bunch of different options. So let's try this one that says Infinite Bombs. To turn this on, all you have to do is just press right on your D-pad to toggle it on, and then select Apply Changes. Now, if we back out into the game and we press the bomb button, you can see I just used one here, I used another one right here, and the number of bombs that I have in the top menu here is not going down. So I have infinite bombs right now. And if you're happy with that, you can just go ahead and, use the game like this, but you could also save it so that any time that you load up this game, it's going to load up that cheat. You're going to go into the cheats menu. There's an option here that says auto apply cheats during game load. Once we turn that one on, we want to save this as an override. And because we only want it to work with this one specific game, we're going to select save game overrides. This means that anytime we start up Contra 3 on the Super Nintendo, we're going to have infinite bombs because we turned it on, we told it to load it every time we start the game, and then we saved it as a game override. I know it's a little bit complex in terms of the layers, but that's essentially how you would set something like this up. So let's go ahead and try this out. I'm going to press select and start to close out of the game. I'm going to go back into the main menu. I'm going to go back into the Super Nintendo menu here. I'm going to start up the game again. This time it's going to auto load where I was before because we have those auto save states on, and it also says applying these cheat changes. So if I press the bomb button, sure enough, I can have the bomb and the bomb number is not going down. And honestly, that's about it when it comes to running RetroArch, and that's, I think, enough information to really be dangerous. The last thing I want to show is that emulation station front end that we set up previously. Now, we haven't really done anything other than just created the game folders and then put our games there and then pointed RetroArch to them. But the nice thing about Emulation Station is that you can really change the look and feel of your overall system. So now I'm going to quit out of RetroArch, and this time I'm going to go back to my menu and start up Emulation Station. This one is really great because it will actually auto-scan all of your folders, and if it finds games within those folders that match what it's looking for, it's actually going to show them on the screen. So every system I'm seeing right now is a system that I added games to. And if we want, we can just press the A button to jump into each menu, and we can actually navigate through and start up each of our games. settings. However, there are other things that we can do within Emulation Station which makes it very powerful and kind of easier to use than RetroArch itself. Number one, we didn't have to make any playlist in the first place, they all just appeared, so you don't have to do any of that scanning directory stuff. In addition, anytime you add or remove a game, it's going to know, and so you don't actually have to rescan the playlist or anything else like that. Also, if we press start and go into the main menu, under UI settings, we have a theme downloader option. And so within here, it's going to give us a list of all these different themes that you can use, and you can download each of them one by one. It's kind of like having a little store where you can play all your games. So let's do this one right here called Canvas. After we've downloaded the theme, we can go back into the UI settings menu, and then under theme, we can see that, yeah, now we have the Canvas option. Let's pick that and then back out. And so there we go. We now have something with a different look and feel than we had previously. And as you can imagine, you can do this with all the other UI settings and themes that we had already shown. There are other things we can do as well, like scraping box art and videos and stuff like that, but that's a little bit outside of the scope of a RetroArch guide. The only other thing I would mention is that you need to press the start button, go into other settings, and then alternative emulators. This will give you a list of all of the RetroArch cores and other emulator cores that they plan on using within Emulation Station to boot that game. Now, as you can see, the default Emulation Station options are almost identical to the cores that I recommended, so I really don't have to make many changes except for NES. For this one, I like to use the Nestopia core, so instead I'm going to pick that one to make sure that it opens the correct emulator, and other than that, we are good to go. So let's try this out. Let's go into Game Boy and let's go and start up Castlevania 2 again. Now when we start up the game, it's not only going to jump directly into where we were before because of the auto-save and auto-load thing, but it also is showing that Game Boy DMG internal colorization and also that LCD grid effect. So all those changes that we made in RetroArch carry over because Emulation Station is simply just launching this game within RetroArch. However, one thing to notice right here, if we press select and start, it doesn't take us back to Emulation Station. Instead, it closes the content and takes us back to RetroArch. And this is what I was talking about earlier. If you go into the hotkeys section, you can either quit out of a game or you can close content. And so what we want to do is disassociate the start button with close content and instead make it for quit. So for quit, we can press the start button again. Now it says button 6. However, we also want to avoid a conflict because both of these are now assigned to start. So I'm going to press the X button. It's going to clear it out. Now I can go into the main section, go into configuration files, save current configuration, and now every game is going to quit when I press select and start. And so now let's try out DuckTales. So I'm going to open up this game here. You can see that obviously we're going to get the nice Game Boy colorization and the grid effect. Everything seems to be looking good. And now if we press select and start, it's going to quit out of the game and just take us right back to Emulation Station. And so now we have kind of a retro system going where it's using RetroArch as our underlying option, but it's a lot prettier to look at than just the RetroArch menu. And honestly, that's about it when it comes to configuring RetroArch. I know it's a really daunting application, but once you do the right things in the right order, it actually kind of starts to fall into place. And there's an entire rabbit hole of things that you can do within RetroArch, but I think it's outside of the scope of a starter guide. And so I'm going to leave it at that, but let me know if you have any questions in the comments down below. And like I mentioned before, I've got a full written guide about this entire thing. I've had it up for years, and I just did a recent update to it. And so if you have any questions about how any of this stuff works, you want to dive a little bit more deeply into it, I'd recommend checking out that written guide or even just the RetroArch webpage in the first place. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.